There is a moment in life, usually quiet, usually private, when something shatters. Not your bones, but your blueprint of the world. It arrives without spectacle. The realization that no one is coming, that if you cry out, the silence will only grow heavier. For most, this moment flickers and fades. But for some, like Jean Améry, it brands the psyche permanently. It becomes the cornerstone of a philosophy born not in abstraction, but in the raw materials of human cruelty. His thought did not emerge from curiosity, it was forced out by pain, like breath from a drowning man. Améry was not just a witness to history, he was devoured by it. Tortured by the Gestapo in Fort Breendonk, later imprisoned in Auschwitz, his suffering did not resolve into a redemptive arc. It calcified into insight. What was torn from him was not merely safety or family or a homeland, it was the basic premise that human beings are anchored in meaning and trust. He became a philosopher only after being unmade as a man. His philosophy was not theory, it was scar tissue worded carefully as if each syllable might reopen the wound. To speak of Améry is to speak of betrayal, but not the kind dramatized in novels or political thrillers. This is a deeper betrayal, the betrayal by the very idea that the world makes sense. For most, trust is a silent contract with existence. That kindness will be returned, that violence is an aberration, that reality is somewhat reliable. But when you are tortured, when you experience terror administered calmly, rationally, and without apology, this contract is voided. Permanently. Améry described this not as trauma, but as an ontological break. A split between who you were and what you now know. Psychologically, betrayal trauma is one of the most destabilizing forces to the human mind. It doesn't just hurt, it unhomes you. Especially when it comes not from an external enemy but from the society you were taught to trust. Survivors of such trauma live not in the past but in the trauma itself, because it no longer belongs to time. It has invaded their structure of meaning. For Améry, it was not just that the world had hurt him, it was that the world had revealed itself as capable of that hurt. And there is no forgetting that. What makes Améry singular is his refusal to move on. He didn't subscribe to the illusion of closure or the cultural pressure to heal. In a world obsessed with resilience and optimism, he stood as a monument to unyielding memory. His insistence on resentment, as a form of moral accuracy, not weakness, was revolutionary. To remember was not to dwell, it was to bear witness. And in that witness he found a kind of inverted dignity. He knew some experiences do not end. They simply deepen like a well into which the self continues to fall. In philosophical terms, Améry ruptured the notion of post-traumatic integration. He challenged the idea that one must fit trauma back into a coherent life narrative. Some traumas are anti-narrative. They don't get metabolized, they metabolize you. They rewrite your emotional grammar, your ethical assumptions, your cognitive map. His work exists as a rare document of what happens when a human being is not just hurt, but permanently decontextualized from the idea of human safety. Améry lived, but he no longer belonged to life as others understood it. So this is not a story of survival. It is a story of what survives inside the survivor when the world ceases to make moral sense. Améry's life forces us to confront an unbearable truth, that there are wounds so deep they do not close and perhaps should not. His writing is not there to uplift but to disillusion. And in that disillusionment lies his strange gift. A raw, unfiltered honesty for those who, too, have stared into the abyss and found it staring back. The mind, once altered by this fracture, never returns to wholeness. But maybe it learns to see with new eyes. Section 1. The first blow, the ontological rupture of torture. They thought pain would be the worst part. That's the first illusion torture destroys. Pain is manageable, it has structure, a beginning, a crescendo, a scream. But it is not the pain that unmakes a person. It's the collapse of meaning in the face of that pain. The first blow isn't an assault on the body, it's a theft of coherence, a violation of the implicit promise that the world has rules, limits, and moral structure. You don't descend into chaos. You are dropped into it, unprepared, unclothed, unspoken for. When Jean Améry said, "Only in torture does the transformation of person to flesh become complete," he wasn't offering poetry. He was reporting a fact of phenomenology. Your name, your memories, your ideas, all of it is peeled back until what's left is pure sentience locked in a meat shell. And the body, which once stood upright in history, collapses into a present so claustrophobic that even the concept of before or after becomes a foreign language. You're not being hurt. You're hurt. The distinction vanishes. Torture doesn't just sever nerves, it severs time. The temporal structure of experience, what psychology calls the narrative self, implodes. This isn't pain you look back on. It's pain that eats time. Torture is a now that loops, that self-replicates, that hijacks memory and replaces it with presence. This is why trauma isn't a scar, it's an engine. PTSD is not a disorder of recollection. It's a disorder of return. The tortured don't live forward anymore. They orbit the moment of rupture. Améry doesn't speak of healing. He writes from the wound. His brilliance lies in refusing to spiritualize survival or romanticize recovery. He doesn't seek transcendence. He seeks accuracy. Torture, he understood, doesn't just rearrange your psychological furniture. It detonates the entire floor plan of reality. You cannot go back to the world where things made sense, where a knock on the door wasn't followed by fists, or a question wasn't preluded by cruelty. The world isn't lost, it is revealed as treacherous. In that revelation, the torturer is not just an agent of violence, but a god of unmaking. They exercise ontological power. They don't just harm you, they redefine what it means to be harmed. What it means to be. You, the victim, cease being a participant in your own existence. You are acted upon. Existence becomes an imposed condition, not a chosen stance. You no longer have a body, you are a body. And that body is a target, a message, a disposable object in someone else's moral vacuum. Heidegger spoke of Dasein, of being thrown into the world. But torture rethrows you into non-world. A place where speech has no purchase, where humanity has no referent, where you look at your own limbs and feel they are held hostage by sensation. There is no transcendence here. No silver lining. No survivor's nobility. There is only the fact of flesh, the betrayal of your skin by the hands that touch it. You will never again live in a world untouched by this inversion of meaning. You are not who you were. You are not someone at all. This is not dramatization. It's a record of what happens when trust dies, not abstract trust, but the primal, pre-verbal contract that says, I exist among others who see me as human. Torture rips up that contract and replaces it with one written in silence, in terror, in broken time. And that's why Jean Améry's philosophy begins not in theory, but in the first blow. That is where metaphysics shatters, and from those shards, his radical honesty emerges. But what if the people administering this rupture wore suits, cited Kant, and quoted Goethe? What if the collapse of being wasn't chaos, but order perfected for cruelty? Section 2. Civilization betrayed, the intellectual as accessory to catastrophe. It is easy to imagine barbarity arriving with chaos, with the uneducated, the irrational, the wild. But in the case of Jean Améry's tormentors, the horror arrived in polished shoes with clipped grammar, and with an appetite for Schopenhauer quotes. These men, his torturers, were not beasts prowling the margins of civilization. They were its appointed stewards. In their hands, reason did not prevent cruelty. It organized it. They weren't devoid of culture. They were shaped by it. And that is the enduring, paralyzing betrayal. Culture did not fail to stop evil. It refined it, sanitized it, clothed it in paperwork and euphemism. You grow up believing that education breeds empathy, that literature opens the soul, and that rational discourse tames primal violence. But what Améry saw was reason conscripted into violence with surgical precision. The men who broke his body had read the great thinkers. They were fluent in classical music. They spoke in soft tones and took notes in perfect handwriting. This wasn't ignorance, it was intellect emptied of conscience. These men turned their minds inward, not to question the horror they administered, but to refine its process. For them, pain became protocol. This is what Améry meant when he wrote about reason cruelty, the terrifying convergence of intelligence and malevolence. Think of Auschwitz not as a spontaneous eruption of hatred but as a blueprint, designed and revised by men who understood systems, who knew how to eliminate variables. The camps were not chaotic. They were logistical achievements. Rail schedules. Population statistics. Body disposal mechanisms calculated with eerie precision. It was civilization's crowning project. Violence rendered industrial. That's what makes Améry's critique so unflinching. He does not attack monsters but men. He does not describe collapse but continuity. The same tools we used to build schools and courts were re-engineered to build gas chambers. The betrayal, then, is not that civilization failed, it succeeded in the wrong direction. In that success lies a crisis of faith that doesn't end with Améry's generation. You must ask, how many of today's systems, legal, corporate, academic, function with the same detachment? Are your institutions built on empathy or on metrics? Are your policies guided by justice or efficiency? Bureaucracy rarely shouts, it hums, it processes, it dehumanizes by routine. When the human being becomes data, and suffering is an acceptable loss in a balance sheet, reason has once again betrayed its charge. What Améry warned of was not just the past but the reappearance of that logic wherever the human cost is seen as necessary collateral. They want you to believe evil looks like rage and ignorance. But what if it wears glasses and quotes Kant? What if it sits behind a desk and smiles politely? Améry had to face a world where the same rationality that creates hospitals could also calculate the ideal starvation rate for camp inmates. This duality, the genius and the genocide, must be seen not as contradiction but as possibility. A culture that teaches reason without grounding it in empathy builds bridges to nowhere. It produces minds capable of brilliance but barren of moral soil. In that desert, atrocity flourishes. Améry's critique is therefore not only ethical but ontological. He shows you that civilization, as you've been taught to worship it, is not inherently good. It is a structure. What you put inside it determines its soul. And if that soul is neglected, if reason is severed from suffering, then the library becomes a laboratory for pain. His philosophy is not one of hope, it's a brutal dissection. The Enlightenment gave us logic. But in the absence of compassion, that logic becomes an instrument, not of salvation, but of silent destruction. This was the post-torture realization Améry brought back from the edge. So you are left with the uncomfortable task of looking around your world and asking, where does this betrayal of intellect still live? Where has education become complicity? Where is neutrality just a more elegant form of submission? Jean Améry doesn't ask you to abandon thought, but to make it accountable. If it cannot speak for the victim, it has no right to exist. His was not just a scream against pain, it was a scream against polite conversation while that pain occurs. The silence of thinkers is not neutrality, it is participation. And now, with intellect itself under suspicion, we arrive at Améry's most radical assertion, that perhaps the only honest act left after truth has been tortured, is to die by it, willingly, lucidly. In the next section we follow him to the edge of that clarity. Section 3, Lucid Finality, Suicide as Philosophical Protest. You live within a world that insists you heal, move on, rebuild, forgive, forget. But what happens when that demand itself becomes unbearable? A pressure to erase your own truth, to sanitize your pain. Jean Améry faced this pressure with brutal clarity. For him, survival was not liberation but an unending sentence. The idea that one could recover from what was irreparable was a lie that he could no longer bear to carry. In his eyes, life had become an unbearable performance, an act of pretending to move beyond what was fundamentally untranscendable. When truth and life diverge this irreconcilably, the choice to die lucidly is not surrender but the ultimate protest. Améry's philosophy of suicide, articulated in his essay on suicide, is not the cry of a broken man crushed by despair. It is the deliberate, conscious reclamation of death as free thought, a free death. This death is chosen not from weakness, but from radical lucidity, a refusal to submit to false narratives of healing that demand reconciliation without justice. The world demands that victims forgive and forget to preserve its own peace, but Améry resists this erasure. He refuses to allow his suffering to be glossed over, to be normalized or rendered irrelevant by the comforts of collective amnesia. His death is a refusal to be complicit in that false peace. You must understand that Améry's suicide is not a withdrawal from life but a philosophical act of rebellion against it. His final decision is an assertion of agency in a world designed to strip him of it. 4 years he was stripped of his body's integrity, his identity, his trust in humanity. Now, with full consciousness, he takes back the one last domain of freedom, the choice to end his own story on his own terms. In this act, he is no longer the passive victim but the sovereign subject, reclaiming authorship over his fate. This is autonomy in its most radical form. Survivor's guilt, which haunts so many who escape atrocity, is for Améry not just a psychological burden, it is a philosophical stance. It manifests as resentment, a vigilant ethical memory that refuses to let the world forget the crimes committed. To forget, to forgive prematurely, would be a betrayal, not only of the past but of the moral responsibility owed to those who were silenced forever. This resentment becomes a weapon against collective forgetting, a demand that atrocity remain present in consciousness, a protest against the dilution of horror into history. His life and his death insist that you carry this memory, not as a curse but as an imperative. Améry's act challenges you to reconsider what autonomy truly means when all structures of meaning have been dismantled. Nietzsche spoke of the will to power, the force by which one asserts oneself amid chaos. Améry extends this to the realm of existential freedom, where the power to say no to life itself, when life contradicts truth, becomes the last refuge of authenticity. Camus' absurd freedom finds an echo here, the freedom to face a world devoid of justice without illusion, and still choose the terms of your existence or your departure. To live under the lie of healing would be to betray oneself. To die lucidly is to refuse that betrayal. The tragedy is profound, but so is the defiance. In Améry's Suicide, you do not find defeat but a fiercely honest confrontation with the abyss. It is the refusal to consent to lies, the refusal to participate in society's collective self-deception. It is a scream into the void that insists, this wound will never heal, this truth will never be hidden, this life, stripped of trust and hope, will not be prolonged in bad faith. His death is a testament to the unbearable weight of unhealed trauma and the courage it takes to carry it without capitulation. And so, as you reflect on Améry's journey, from the betrayal of trust, through the weaponization of reason, to the final act of philosophical protest, you confront a question that haunts every survivor, every witness. How do you live in a world that demands forgetting when memory is your only resistance? And when the demand to live peacefully becomes the demand to lie, what is left to do? You come to Jean Améry not seeking comfort or consolation, but a mirror held up to the darkest recesses of human experience. His words offer no redemption, no easy answers, no balm for the soul. Instead, he confronts you with the raw, unvarnished truth, the brutal fracture where civilization's promises collapse under the weight of betrayal. Améry's legacy is not a soothing narrative of survival but a stark indictment of the moral illusions that undergird society. He forces you to face the uncomfortable reality that reason and progress often mask profound complicity in cruelty. The veneer of civilization does not always civilize. It sometimes refines and rationalizes violence, transforming brutality into bureaucratic order. To watch this channel is to embrace that discomfort, to reject the seductive call of illusions that smooth over suffering with platitudes. This space is for those who prefer the piercing light of truth to the numbing shadows of denial. If you believe that silence is not a refuge but a weapon used to erase pain in history, you stand alongside us. Here, memory is sacred and refusing to forget becomes a moral act. By sharing your voice in comments, subscribing, or spreading these ideas, you take part in a quiet but potent resistance. One that defies the erasure of trauma and insists on the preservation of memory as an ethical imperative. The human spirit, far from the invincible force popular mythology would have you believe, is fragile, fractured, and haunted by its own vulnerabilities. Améry's writings remind us that survival is not synonymous with wholeness or healing. Often, the scars that trauma leaves are not merely wounds but fractures in the very foundation of identity and trust. These are not the kinds of breaks that mend with time or therapy alone. They alter your relationship to existence itself, creating a permanent rupture that challenges the narrative of resilience. Recognizing this fragility is not weakness. It is the first step toward authentic understanding and empathy. In the broader social context, civilization's claim to moral superiority unravels under scrutiny. The same systems designed to protect and nurture often participate in, or tacitly permit horrors that defy the bounds of ethical reason. Améry's critique exposes this dark truth. Civilization with its institutions and rules sometimes becomes a machine for refining cruelty, bureaucratic violence hidden behind the masks of legality and order. It is a chilling reminder that reason without conscience is a dangerous tool, one that can be wielded to justify unspeakable acts with cold, administrative efficiency. Améry compels us not to smooth over this fracture with simplistic narratives of forgiveness or reconciliation that fail to reckon with justice. To reconcile prematurely is to erase the memory of suffering, to betray those who cannot speak, and to diminish the weight of atrocity. Instead, he urges an ethical stance grounded in unflinching honesty, an acceptance that some wounds cannot be healed because their significance transcends individual pain, touching the collective conscience and demanding perpetual remembrance. To keep these wounds open, to refuse closure, is to honor the truth of what was endured and to resist the forces that seek to silence or diminish it. This refusal to reconcile pain with false meaning becomes a radical act of human dignity. It is a stand against the narratives that seek to contain suffering within neat, comforting packages. By embracing the dissonance and refusing to close the wound, you participate in a kind of witness-bearing, a testimony that challenges society to face its darkest truths. In this way, memory becomes a form of resistance, and trauma becomes a call to moral vigilance. Through Améry, we learn that to be truly human is to carry the burden of remembrance, not to discard it for the sake of comfort or convenience. So, as you close this chapter on Améry's thought and legacy, carry with you this profound lesson. The human spirit is neither unbreakable nor meant to be sanitized by facile consolations. Civilization's progress is often built on the erasure of pain and the betrayal of moral clarity. In standing with Améry, you reject this erasure and embrace the difficult but necessary work of remembering, reflecting, and resisting. Because some wounds must remain open, not as scars to be hidden, but as living, breathing reminders of our shared humanity. And it is in keeping these wounds alive that we truly honor the depth of what it means to survive, to resist, and ultimately to remain human.